The blast shook Jake Morrison from his unconscious state, and he could taste blood in his mouth and feel the cold metal floor beneath his bruised body. His head pounded like someone was hitting it with a hammer, and his vision was blurry, but he could see the strange blue lights above him and hear the clicking sounds that meant he was no longer on a human ship. The UES Liberty was gone, and he was now a prisoner of the Zeralian Empire. Jake tried to move his arms, but thick metal bands held them behind his back, and similar restraints locked his legs in place so he could barely shift his position on the floor. The room around him was dark, except for those eerie blue lights that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, and the walls looked like they were made from some kind of black metal that absorbed most of the light. He could hear footsteps approaching, but they did not sound like human boots on metal decking. Instead, they made a tapping noise like claws on stone. Two tall figures entered the room, and Jake could see they were Zeralians even in the dim light, because of their distinctive insect-like appearance, with long, thin limbs and heads that looked like they belonged on giant beetles. Their skin was a dark green color that seemed to shimmer in the blue light, and they moved with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. One of them spoke in the clicking language of their people, while the other produced a small device that projected a hologram showing what looked like star charts and tactical information. Jake knew he was in serious trouble because the Zeralians did not usually take prisoners, and when they did, it was only to extract information before executing the captive in the most painful way possible. His mission to investigate the strange energy readings near the Vega system had been supposed to be routine reconnaissance, but the Zeralian fleet had been waiting for them as if they knew exactly when and where the Liberty would arrive. The ambush had been perfect and deadly, with Jake being the only survivor from his crew of 12 good people. The guards grabbed Jake by his arms and lifted him to his feet with surprising strength, and he found himself being marched through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, with walls covered in strange symbols and artwork that showed scenes of conquest and domination. Other Zeralians moved through the passages, and they all stopped to stare at the human prisoner with what looked like curiosity mixed with disgust. Some of them clicked angrily when they saw him, and Jake could guess they were probably discussing how best to make him suffer for the crimes of his species. They brought him to a massive chamber with a ceiling so high that it disappeared into shadows and walls decorated with trophies from 100 conquered worlds, including what looked like pieces of human ships and equipment. At the far end of the room was a throne made from black crystal that seemed to absorb light, and sitting on that throne was the most terrifying and beautiful creature Jake had ever seen. Queen Vex Alia was larger than the other Zeralians, and her exoskeleton was a deep purple color with silver markings that formed intricate patterns across her body. She had 6 eyes arranged in 2 rows across her face, and each one seemed to glow with its own inner light. Her head was crowned with a series of sharp spines that looked like they could cut through steel, and her arms ended in claws that could probably tear a human apart without much effort. She wore robes made from some kind of material that shifted color as she moved, and around her neck was a collar of what looked like compressed stars. The guards forced Jake to his knees before the throne, and he could feel the weight of dozens of alien eyes upon him as the court watched to see what their queen would do with this latest prize. Jake lifted his head and met the queen's gaze with as much defiance as he could manage, because he was determined not to give these creatures the satisfaction of seeing him beg or break down in fear. But something strange happened when Queen Vexalia looked at Jake, because her 6 eyes suddenly widened and her mandibles began to twitch in what looked like shock or surprise. She leaned forward on her throne and stared at the human prisoner with an intensity that made the air in the chamber feel electric. The other Zeralians began to click and whisper among themselves because they had never seen their queen react this way to any prisoner before. The queen raised one clawed hand, and the whispers stopped immediately as every creature in the chamber fell silent and waited for her to speak. Her voice was like the sound of wind through metal when she finally spoke in perfect human language that surprised Jake, because few Zeralians bothered to learn the tongues of the species they conquered. She asked Jake what his name was, and when. He told her. She repeated it slowly as if she was testing how it sounded, and her 6 eyes never left his face for even a moment. She asked him where he was born and what ship he had served on, and other questions that seemed oddly personal for an interrogation. Jake answered honestly because he saw no point in lying when she could probably extract any information she wanted through torture or alien technology. The queen dismissed most of her court with sharp commands in the Zeralian language, but she kept her most trusted advisor beside the throne, and Jake could see this creature was different from the others, because his exoskeleton was scarred from many battles, and one of his arms had been replaced with mechanical parts. The advisor, whose name Jake would later learn was General Thexmore, watched the exchange between human and queen with growing suspicion. Queen Vexalia continued to study Jake's face with an expression that seemed almost hungry, and Jake began to feel like she was looking for something specific, but he had no idea what it could be. She asked him about his childhood and his family and the world where he had grown up, and Jake found himself talking about Haven's Rest and the farm where his parents had raised crops and livestock under the light of twin suns. When Jake mentioned Haven's Rest, the queen's entire body went rigid, and her claws dug into the armrests of her throne with enough force to leave gouges in the crystal. She whispered the name of the world, like it was something precious and terrible at the same time, and Jake could see that something was happening inside her mind that he did not understand. The silence in the throne room stretched on until it became almost unbearable, and Jake could hear his own heartbeat in his ears while he waited for whatever was coming next. Queen Vexalia finally spoke again, but this time her voice was different, somehow softer and more uncertain than it had been before, and she asked Jake a question that changed everything between them. She asked him if he had ever helped a wounded stranger, and Jake felt his blood turn to ice as memories from 15 years ago came flooding back. 15 years earlier, Jake Morrison had been just 17 years old and working on his family's farm on Haven's Rest when the solar storm hit the system and filled the sky with colors that should not have existed. The storm lasted for 3 days and knocked out most of the colony's communication systems while causing strange readings on every piece of electronic equipment they owned. Jake's father had told him to check the outer fields for damage to their irrigation systems, and that was how Jake found himself walking through the forest that bordered their property when he heard the sound of metal tearing through trees. The crash site was a mess of twisted metal and smoking debris scattered across a clearing that had been burned black by the impact, and Jake could see that whatever had fallen from the sky was definitely not human in origin. The ship was small and sleek with curves that looked organic rather than manufactured, and it was made from materials that seemed to shift color in the flickering light of the fires that still burned around the wreckage. Jake knew he should have reported the crash to the colonial authorities, but something made him hesitate. A weak sound came from inside the wreck, and Jake realized that something might still be alive in there, so he climbed over the hot metal and broken parts to reach what looked like it might have been a cockpit. Inside, he found a creature that was clearly alien, but not like anything he had seen in the colonial defense videos they showed in school. This alien was smaller than the pictures of the monsters that were supposed to be conquering the galaxy. And instead of looking terrifying, it just looked hurt and scared. The alien had 6 eyes that were dim with pain, and its breathing was shallow and irregular while green liquid that was probably blood seeped from wounds across its body. Jake could see that one of its arms was bent at an angle that looked very wrong, and there were burns on its exoskeleton where pieces of the ship had fallen on it during the crash. For a moment, Jake and the alien just stared at each other, and Jake could see intelligence in those 6 eyes, along with something that looked almost like hope. Jake made a decision that would change his life forever, and instead of running away or calling for help, he began trying to figure out how to get the alien out of the wreckage. It took him almost an hour of careful work to free the creature without causing more damage, and when he finally pulled it clear of the ship, Jake could see that it was even smaller than he had thought, maybe only reaching up to his shoulder if it could stand. The alien tried to speak, but the sounds it made were just clicks and whistles that Jake could not understand. Jake looked around the clearing and realized that if anyone else found this crash site, they would probably kill the alien first and ask questions later because the colonies had been at war with various alien species for years, and most people assumed that any alien was automatically an enemy. Jake made another decision that surprised even him, and he picked up the wounded creature and began carrying it deeper into the forest, away from the crash site, and toward an old hunting cabin his grandfather had built years before the colony was established. The cabin was small and had not been used in a long time, but it was still weatherproof and far enough from the main settlement that no one was likely to find it by accident. Jake made the alien as comfortable as he could on an old sleeping bag, and then went back to hide the crash site by spreading dirt and leaves over the wreckage until it looked like just another pile of forest debris. He knew this would not fool a serious search, but it might buy him some time to figure out what to do next. Over the next several days, Jake found himself making regular trips to the cabin with food and water and medical supplies he took from the farm's first aid kit. The alien was clearly very intelligent, and it began trying to communicate with Jake using simple drawings scratched in the dirt floor of the cabin. Jake learned that the creature's name was something that sounded like Vexalia, and that it had been on some kind of scouting mission when the solar storm damaged its ship's navigation systems. Jake brought books and pictures from the colony to help them communicate better, and Vexalia proved to be a quick learner who picked up basic human language within just a few days. She told Jake about her world and her people, and Jake was surprised to learn that the Xeralians were not the mindless monsters that colonial propaganda had made them out to be. Vexalia described a civilization that valued honor and knowledge and exploration, even though they were currently at war with humanity. As Vexalia recovered from her injuries, she and Jake spent long hours talking about their different worlds and the war that was raging between their species. Jake learned that Vexalia was from a noble family, but she was young and idealistic, and had joined the Scout Service because she wanted to explore the galaxy and discover new things rather than just fight battles. Vexalia was fascinated by human culture, and especially by the way humans could be kind to strangers, even when those strangers were supposed to be their enemies. Jake brought Vexalia books about human history and art and music, and she absorbed everything with an eagerness that reminded Jake of his younger sister when she was learning to read. In return, Vexalia told Jake stories about the worlds she had visited and the strange and wonderful things she had seen among the stars. She showed him pictures stored in a small device that had survived the crash, and Jake saw planets with purple oceans and cities that floated in the clouds and creatures that were beautiful beyond anything he could have imagined. During the 3 weeks that Vexalia stayed in the cabin, Jake began to understand that the war between humans and aliens was not as simple as he had been taught. Vexalia explained that her people had originally approached humanity hoping to establish peaceful contact, but misunderstandings and fear on both sides had led to conflict instead of cooperation. She said that there were factions among her people who wanted to end the war, but they were being overpowered by those who believed that conquest was the only way to deal with other species. Jake found himself looking forward to his visits to the cabin, and he began to think of Vexalia as a friend rather than an enemy. She had a curious mind and a gentle nature that seemed completely at odds with everything he had been told about aliens, and Jake began to wonder how many other misconceptions he had been taught. Vexalia seemed equally fascinated by Jake, and she often asked him questions about human emotions and relationships that made him think about things in new ways. The end came suddenly when Jake arrived at the cabin one morning to find Vexalia standing outside and looking up at the sky where he could see the dark shapes of alien ships descending through the atmosphere. She had been using a small communication device to send out distress signals, and her rescue had finally arrived. Jake felt a strange sadness at the thought of losing his new friend, but he knew that Vexalia needed to return to her own people. Vexalia thanked Jake for saving her life and caring for her when he could have easily left her to die or turned her over to the colonial authorities. She told him that she would never forget his kindness and that she hoped someday their 2 species could find a way to live in peace. Before she left, she gave Jake a small crystalline device that glowed with soft blue light and told him it was a token of gratitude that he should keep to remember their time together. Jake watched from the forest as the alien ships landed and took Vexalia away, and he never told anyone about what had happened during those 3 weeks. He kept the crystal device hidden in his room, and sometimes when he looked at it, he wondered what had become of the young alien scout who had changed his understanding of the universe. He never expected to see Vexalia again, and he certainly never imagined that when they met again she would be a queen and he would be her prisoner. The recognition hit Queen Vexalia like a physical blow, and she could feel her heart's beating faster as memories she had buried deep in her mind came flooding back with perfect clarity. The human kneeling before her throne was older now, with lines around his eyes and scars on his face that spoke of years spent fighting in the war between their species. But she could still see the kind young man who had saved her life 15 years ago on a world called Haven's Rest. The boy who had chosen compassion over fear and friendship over hatred was now her prisoner, and she held his life in her claws. Vexalia forced herself to remain calm and show no emotion as she studied Jake's face and saw the exact moment when he recognized her as well. His eyes widened slightly, and she could see him trying to reconcile the wounded scout he had helped with the feared queen, who now ruled the Zeralian Empire through conquest and terror. She wondered what he thought of what she had become and whether he regretted the kindness he had shown to a stranger who had grown up to become his enemy. The years since their meeting had not been kind to either of them, and Vex'ahlia knew that the path she had taken to reach her throne was paved with the deaths of countless beings from dozens of worlds. She had started out as an idealistic young scout who dreamed of peace between species, but the harsh realities of Zeralian politics and the demands of war had gradually worn away her gentle nature until only the ruthless queen remained. She had done terrible things to gain power, and even worse things to keep it, and she sometimes wondered if any trace of the person Jake had known still existed inside her. General Thexmore watched the exchange between his queen and the human prisoner with growing suspicion, and Vex'ahlia could see him trying to understand why she was taking so long to order the execution. Thexmore had been her most trusted advisor for the past 5 years, and he had helped her consolidate power after she took the throne from her predecessor, but she knew that his loyalty was based on fear and self-interest rather than genuine devotion. If he sensed any weakness in her, he would not hesitate to move against her and use that weakness to advance his own position. Vex'ahlia knew that she should order Jake's immediate execution because that was what her subjects expected from their queen, and any show of mercy toward a human would be seen as weakness that could undermine her authority. The Zeralian Empire had been built on the principle that conquest was the natural order of the universe, and that showing compassion to enemies was a fatal flaw that led to defeat and destruction. Her people respected strength above all else, and they followed her because they believed she possessed the ruthlessness necessary to lead them to total victory over all other species. But as Vex'ahlia looked at Jake, she could not forget the 3 weeks she had spent in that cabin learning about human nature and discovering that everything she had been taught about the enemy was wrong. Jake had risked his own safety to help a wounded stranger and had asked for nothing in return except the knowledge that he had done the right thing. He had shown her that humans were capable of great kindness and that the war between their species was based on misunderstanding rather than fundamental incompatibility. The internal conflict that raged within Vex'ahlia as she tried to decide Jake's fate was like a battle between 2 different versions of herself, and she could feel the stress threatening to tear her apart. The queen who had conquered worlds and destroyed fleets demanded that she execute the human immediately to maintain her reputation for ruthless efficiency, but the young scout who had once dreamed of peace whispered that this might be an opportunity to find a different path forward. Jake remained silent throughout the long pause, and Vex'ahlia could see that he understood the impossible position she was in, even though he could not know all the details of her rise to power. He had always been perceptive, even as a young man, and now he seemed to realize that any word from him might tip the balance one way or another, so he waited for her to make her choice. The respect he showed for her dilemma reminded her of why she had liked him so much during their brief time together. General Thexmore finally broke the silence by suggesting that the human prisoner should be taken to the interrogation chambers, where they could extract information about human fleet movements and defensive positions before proceeding with the execution. His tone was casual, but Vex'ahlia could hear the subtle challenge in his words, and she knew that he was testing her resolve. If she showed any hesitation about torturing and killing a human prisoner, he would begin to question her fitness to rule the Empire. Vex'ahlia made a decision that surprised everyone in the throne room, including herself, and she announced that this particular human would be subjected to a series of trials that would test his worth and determine whether he deserved the death of a warrior or the fate of a slave. She claimed that she was curious about human capabilities and wanted to study this specimen more carefully before deciding his ultimate fate. The explanation was thin, but it gave her time to figure out what she really wanted to do with Jake. The court accepted her decision because queens were not expected to explain their reasoning to anyone, but Vex'ahlia could see the calculating look in Thexmore's eyes, and she knew that he would be watching her very carefully from now on. Any sign that she was compromised by sentiment or weakness would give him the excuse he needed to challenge her leadership, and she would have to be very careful about how she handled the situation with Jake. After dismissing the court, Vex'ahlia ordered that Jake be taken to comfortable quarters rather than the usual prison cells, and she instructed the guards to treat him as a guest rather than a prisoner, even though he would still be under constant watch. She told herself that she was simply being practical and that keeping Jake healthy would make the upcoming trials more interesting. But she knew that the real reason was that she could not bear the thought of the man who had saved her life being thrown into the dark cells where prisoners were left to rot. That night, Vex'Alia stood alone on the observation deck of her flagship and looked out at the stars while she tried to make sense of the emotions that seeing Jake had awakened in her. She had spent years building walls around her heart and convincing herself that sentiment was a luxury she could not afford. But one look at her old friend had brought all those carefully buried feelings rushing back to the surface. She remembered the long conversations they had shared and the way he had looked at her with curiosity rather than fear, and she wondered if it was possible for them to find that connection again. But even as Vex'Alia allowed herself to remember the past, she knew that the present situation was far more complicated than their first meeting had been. She was no longer a wounded scout who could afford to be idealistic about the possibilities for peace between species, and Jake was no longer a naive farm boy who could make decisions based purely on compassion. They were both products of the war that had shaped their lives, and the roles they had been forced to play might be impossible to set aside. The Queen in Vex'Alia knew that she should kill Jake quickly before her feelings for him became known to others who might use that knowledge against her. But the scout in her wondered if his arrival might be the opportunity she had been unconsciously waiting for, to find a way back to the person she had once been and the dreams she had once held about what the future might bring to both their species if they could learn to trust each other instead of destroying everything they touched. The first trial took place in an arena that had been carved from the hull of a conquered battleship, and Jake found himself standing on sand that had been soaked with the blood of countless prisoners who had fought and died for the entertainment of their captors. The arena was filled with Zoralian nobles and military officers who had come to watch the human face whatever challenge their queen had devised, and Jake could see the hunger for violence in their alien faces as they waited for the spectacle to begin. Queen Vex'Alia watched from her royal box high above the arena floor, and Jake could feel her 6 eyes following his every movement as he examined the weapons that had been provided for him. There was a simple sword that looked like it had been made for human hands and a shield that bore the scars of previous battles, and Jake wondered how many other prisoners had carried these same weapons into combat, knowing they would never leave the arena alive. But when the gates opened to reveal Jake's opponent, he was shocked to see not a fearsome warrior, but a group of human prisoners who had been chained together and forced into the arena against their will. Jake recognized some of them as crew members from other ships that had been captured during recent battles, and he could see the terror in their eyes as they realized what the Zoralians expected them to do. The crowd began to cheer as they anticipated watching humans kill each other for their entertainment. A voice echoed through the arena announcing that Jake could win his freedom by defeating the other humans in combat and that the survivors would be allowed to live as slaves rather than face execution. The rules were simple and brutal, and Jake realized that this was not really a test of his fighting skills, but rather a test of his character and his willingness to sacrifice others to save himself. Queen Vex'Alia was watching to see what kind of man he really was when faced with an impossible choice. Jake threw down his weapons and walked toward the chained prisoners, while the crowd began to mutter in confusion and anger. He began working to free the other humans from their restraints, and he told them that they were going to find another way out of this situation that did not involve killing each other for alien entertainment. Some of the prisoners argued that they should follow the rules and fight because it was their only chance of survival, but Jake convinced them that there had to be a better option. The crowd was becoming restless, and Jake could hear them demanding action as he helped the last prisoner break free from the chains that had bound them together. He looked up at Queen Vex'Alia and saw something that might have been approval in her alien features before she raised her hand and announced that the first trial was complete. She declared that Jake had shown the true strength of humanity by refusing to sacrifice others for his own benefit, and that he had earned the right to face the second challenge. The second trial was different, and Jake found himself alone in a maze that had been constructed from the wreckage of destroyed starships, with passages that twisted and turned in ways that made no logical sense. Hidden throughout the maze were automated defense systems that would try to kill him if he took a wrong turn. And Jake quickly realized that this was a test of both his intelligence and his survival instincts as he tried to find his way to the center where freedom supposedly waited. But as Jake made his way through the maze, he discovered that he was not alone, and that other prisoners had been released into the labyrinth at different times over the past several months. Some of them had been driven mad by hunger and isolation. and they attacked Jake on sight, thinking that he was another hallucination brought on by their suffering. Others were still sane, but desperate, and they begged him for food or water or simply for human contact after being alone for so long. Jake realized that he could probably reach the center of the maze faster if he traveled alone and avoided the complications that came with helping the other prisoners, but once again, he chose compassion over efficiency. He began gathering the survivors and sharing what little food and water he had been given, and he worked to calm the ones who had been driven to madness by their ordeal. The group moved slowly through the maze, but they moved together, and Jake made sure that no one was left behind. The automated defenses seemed to recognize that Jake was not playing the game according to the rules, and they began to adapt their tactics to compensate for his refusal to abandon the other prisoners. Laser cannons that had been programmed to target individuals began firing at groups, and trap doors that should have only caught one person were widened to catch several at once. Jake realized that Queen Vex'ahlia was testing not just his character, but also his ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining his principles. When Jake finally reached the center of the maze, he was leading a group of 12 other prisoners who had all survived because he had refused to leave them behind. Queen Vex'ahlia was waiting for them in person, and Jake could see something that looked like pride in her alien features as she looked at the group of humans who had refused to turn on each other despite the pressure and temptation to do otherwise. She announced that the second trial was complete and that Jake had once again demonstrated the strength that made humanity worthy of respect. The third trial was the most personal, and Jake found himself in a recreation of the cabin where he had first met Vex'ahlia 15 years ago. Every detail was perfect, from the rough wooden walls to the sleeping bag where she had recovered from her injuries, and Jake realized that she had been carrying these memories with her all these years, just as he had. Sitting in the corner of the cabin was a figure that looked exactly like the young Vex'ahlia he had known, but Jake could tell immediately that this was some kind of artificial construct rather than the real queen. The construct spoke with Vex'ahlia's voice from all those years ago, and it begged Jake to help it escape from the cabin just as the real Vex'ahlia had once needed his help to survive. But Jake could see armed Zeralian guards waiting outside the cabin, and he realized that this was a trap designed to test whether he would repeat the same act of compassion that had started their relationship. If he helped the construct, he would be captured and probably executed, but if he refused, he would fail the trial and face an unknown punishment. Jake sat down across from the construct and began to talk to it about the real Vex'ahlia and the time they had spent together in the original cabin. He told stories about their conversations and the things she had taught him about her people and her world. And gradually, the construct began to respond with memories that only the real Vex'ahlia could have known. Jake realized that this was not just a simple artificial being, but something that contained actual pieces of the Queen's consciousness and memories. As they talked, Jake began to understand that this trial was not really about testing his willingness to help a stranger, but about testing his ability to see past appearances and recognize the truth about who someone really was. The construct might look like the young scout he had known, but it was actually a part of the Queen who now ruled the Zeralian Empire, and Jake had to decide whether he could still care about Vex'ahlia after everything she had become. Jake made his choice, and he told the construct that he would help it not because it looked like his old friend, but because it contained the memories and dreams of someone who had once shown him that enemies could become friends if they were willing to trust each other. He helped the construct stand up, and together they walked out of the cabin to face whatever consequences awaited them, and Jake saw Queen Vex'ahlia herself standing among the guards with an expression that he could not quite read. She announced that the third trial was complete, and that Jake had shown her something she had forgotten about the nature of friendship and loyalty. But she also warned him that the remaining trials would be more difficult because they would test not just his character, but his ability to survive in a universe where good intentions were not always enough to overcome the harsh realities of war and politics. General Thexamore had been watching Queen Vex'ahlia's behavior during the trials with growing alarm and suspicion because her treatment of the human prisoner was completely unlike anything he had seen from her before. The Queen, who had once ordered the execution of entire planetary populations without hesitation, was now going out of her way to create elaborate tests for a single human captive, and Thexamore began to suspect that there was more to this situation than his queen was revealing. The general had built his career on his ability to read political situations and identify weaknesses that could be exploited for personal gain, and he could sense that something fundamental had changed in Vex'alia when the human prisoner was brought before her throne. Her usual cold efficiency had been replaced by something that looked disturbingly like sentiment, and Thexmore knew that sentiment was a luxury that rulers could not afford if they wanted to maintain their grip on power. Thexmore began reaching out to other military commanders and noble houses that might be interested in supporting a change of leadership if the current queen proved to be unfit for her position. He was careful to phrase his concerns in terms of duty and loyalty to the empire rather than personal ambition, but everyone who received his messages understood that he was testing the waters for a possible coup. The responses he received were encouraging, and Thexmore realized that many of the Empire's leaders had their own doubts about the Queen's recent behavior. Meanwhile, Jake was recovering from his trials in quarters that were far more comfortable than anything a prisoner should have expected, and he found himself trying to understand what Queen Vex'alia was really trying to accomplish with these elaborate tests. He could see that she was struggling with some internal conflict, and he began to suspect that the trials were as much about her working through her own feelings as they were about testing his character and abilities. Jake had recognized the real purpose behind each trial, and he understood that Vex'alia was trying to determine whether the person she had known 15 years ago still existed inside him, or whether the war had changed him into someone she could no longer respect. She needed to know if the compassion and integrity he had shown as a young man were still part of who he was, or if they had been worn away by years of fighting and killing in the name of human survival. But Jake also realized that the trials were revealing just as much about Vex'alia as they were about him, and he could see that she was using his responses to examine her own conscience and question the path she had taken since their last meeting. The young scout who had dreamed of peace between species was still alive somewhere inside the ruthless queen, and she was trying to decide whether it was safe to let that person emerge again, or whether doing so would destroy everything she had built. The fourth trial never came because General Thexmore chose that moment to make his move and launched a coup that he hoped would remove Queen Vex'alia from power and place him on the throne instead. He had convinced enough military commanders to support him that he believed victory was certain, but he had underestimated both the loyalty that some officers still felt toward their queen and the political skills that had helped her reach her position in the first place. The coup began with an attack on the royal quarters that was designed to capture or kill Queen Vex'alia before she could organize a defense. But Jake heard the sounds of fighting in the corridors outside his room and realized that something was seriously wrong. His guards had abandoned their posts to join the battle, and Jake found himself free to move through the ship for the first time since his capture. But instead of trying to escape, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Jake armed himself with weapons taken from fallen guards and began making his way toward the throne room because he had figured out that someone was trying to overthrow Queen Vex'alia, and he could not stand by and watch the person who had once been his friend be murdered by ambitious subordinates. He knew that helping an alien queen against her own people made him a traitor to humanity, but he also knew that Vex'alia was the only hope for peace between their species, and her death would mean years more of war and suffering. The battle for control of the ship was fierce, and Jake found himself fighting alongside Zeralian loyalists against the rebels who were trying to reach the throne room. He moved through the corridors like a ghost, using his knowledge of human combat tactics to outflank and surprise enemies who were not prepared to face a human warrior fighting on their own ship. Every Zeralian he killed was one less threat to Queen Vex'alia, and Jake discovered that he was willing to become a killer to protect someone he cared about. Jake reached the throne room just as General Thieth